Okay, great. So I guess we'll begin now. Yeah. So on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Central and Eastern European Council in Canada, I welcome all of our viewers to our annual and this year virtual Black Ribbon Day Symposium, focusing on the history and legacy of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in 1939. I'd also like to send a warm hello to two Canadian MPs, James Bazan and Yvonne Baker, who are joining us online too. My name is Marcus Kolga. I am the president of the Central and Eastern European Council in Canada and a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. This year is quite unlike any other, since Canada's Parliament unanimously voted in 2009 to make August 23rd a National Day of Remembrance for the European victims of Nazism and communism, known as Black Ribbon Day. Our first symposium that year featured Vladimir Kara-Murza as one of our guests, along with Boris Nemtsov, who joined us from Moscow. While we've lived through considerable regional upheavals, the savage assassination of Boris Nemtsov in 2015, and the two poisonings that Vladimir survived, we are now at the confluence of an unprecedented set of geopolitical challenges that threaten the stability of the Western liberal order. And while history is of course important, our focus today will be on these issues: the hope for democratic change in Belarus, and the future of Russia under Vladimir Putin, whose rule may yet extend to 2036. Early this morning, we received the terrible news that Russian anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny had been poisoned and is currently in a coma and on a ventilator. And we know that Vladimir is currently giving media interviews about this, and he may be joining us right away. He may be joining us in a short bit. Now, to help us understand and digest these fast-moving issues, we are incredibly honored to be joined today by two remarkable individuals whose heroic commitment to freedom and democracy has put them in perilous danger, and who continue to lead despite the threats that they face for doing so. Of course, Vladimir Kara-Murza and my dear friend, Andrei Sannikov. Before we begin, allow me to give some historical context to our discussion today. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed 81 years ago on August 23rd, 1939 in Moscow. The agreement, like others signed by the Soviets and Nazis, committed Hitler and Stalin to a period of non-aggression. But unlike other non-aggression treaties, the Hitler-Stalin Pact included a secret protocol that carved up Central and Eastern Europe between Hitler and Stalin and facilitated the coordinated start of the Second World War in Poland. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact subjected millions of Central and Eastern Europeans to violent repression and occupation by the Soviets and Nazis from Finland in the north and to Romania in the south. When Adolf Hitler redirected his aggression towards these millions of Eastern Europeans, including Russians who had suffered Soviet repression, faced the Nazi menace, mass repression, and the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust. Thanks to the Allies, Western Europe was liberated, but Eastern and Central Europe would remain occupied or controlled by the Soviet Union for another half century. For them, the war did not end until 1991. Today, Belarus seems set on a course to finally join its neighbors to become the final nation to emerge from Stalin's shadow and the crypto-Soviet leadership of Aleksandr Lukashenka. In Russia, Vladimir Putin continues to leverage Stalin's World War II legacy to add legitimacy to his own authoritarian rule. Of greater concern is Putin's emulation of Stalin's tactics, including foreign aggression, domestic repression, and the violent silencing of his critics. For their perspectives on how this history is impacting the unfolding events in the region, we are joined by my old friend, Andrei Sannikov, who is a former Belarusian deputy foreign minister and a leading opposition leader and activist. In 2010, Andrei ran as a candidate against Aleksandr Lukashenka in the presidential elections. And in a situation not too different from what we're seeing or what we've been seeing over the past 2 weeks, Andrei was incarcerated in a Minsk KGB facility for peacefully protesting election fraud and was recognized by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience. After 16 months in prison, he was released under pressure from the international community, including Boris Nemtsov, but soon after was forced to flee the country. He continues his work for a free and democratic Belarus in exile. We can only hope that he'll be able to return to Belarus to continue his important work soon. But first, I'm hoping that we'll hear, and there's Vladimir right now. We'll first hear from my dear friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is of course a leading Russian pro-democracy activist, politician, author, and filmmaker. He was a longtime colleague of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov and chairs the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. Vladimir is a former deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and was a candidate for the Russian State Duma. As most of us know, Vladimir was poisoned twice, in 2015 and 2017, and left, like Alexei Navalny, in a coma as retribution for his work on Magnitsky sanctions. Vladimir today is a contributing writer at the Washington Post and hosts a weekly show on Echo Moscow. Vladimir is the vice president of the Free Russia Foundation, and is a senior advisor for human rights accountability at Human Rights First and a senior fellow at Erwin Kotler's Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Now, Vladimir and Andrei will give some introductory remarks for 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a discussion followed by some audience questions. Vladimir may have to leave us soon because, as we all might expect, the media is very keen to speak to him. So Vladimir, if you have time afterward, if you can join us for the discussion, that's great. If you need to leave, that's not a problem. So I'll give the floor to Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Marcus, thank you so much. It's wonderful to join you even in this virtual format, and I hope we get to do this in real life this time next year. Thank you to the Central and Eastern European Council in Canada and the Canadian Congress for organizing this discussion. I remember the very first event in this series was held in August of 2009, which I guess was the 70th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I had the honor of being present in person at the University of Toronto, where Marcus hosted and organized this event. And Boris Nemtsov was the keynote speaker. He couldn't come to Canada himself. He didn't have a visa, and it was too short notice to organize. So he joined by Skype, by video link. And every time he would mention the word FSB, which is the domestic successors of the KGB, Russian Domestic Security Service, the line would break down. We'd have to reconnect again. So after a few such tries, Marcus asked Boris if he could use the euphemism and substitute the FSB with some other term. So it's wonderful to see that you're continuing this tradition. And I hope before long we'll be able to resume this in real life with real human beings in the same person. As Marcus mentioned, this is a very difficult day for many of us. Early this morning, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was heavily poisoned while on a plane from Tomsk to Moscow. The plane landed urgently in Omsk, which is also still in Siberia, and where he's now being attended to in hospital. I must say it's been a groundhog day for me in the most horrible sense from this morning, being in touch with his family and reading about what was happening, because his symptoms and the whole situation is down to the last details is exactly the same as what happened to me during the two poisonings in 2015 and 2017. The coma, the organ failure, the brain swelling, the fact that it happened just before a flight, and also the drumbeat of Kremlin propagandists who have immediately started shouting that no, nobody's poisoned him, he just drank too much alcohol or took some medicine or whatever nonsense they come up with. If you recall, that's a favorite tactic. When Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned in 2004, the Kremlin propaganda said that he had a botched cosmetic surgery. When Aleksandr Litvinenko was poisoned in London in 2006, they said that he was himself dealing with polonium and swallowed it by accident. That's a favorite tactic, to try to put out smears, disinformation, all the rest of it. I think the most important thing I can say is that and the most important thing now is to pray for Alexei and wish him and his loved ones strength and perseverance to pull through this and to stay alive and to come back to good health. And I have no doubt that as soon as he is back to good health, he will resume exactly what he was doing up until this moment. As you know, Alexei Navalny is the most effective and the most prominent voice today, now since Boris Nemtsov was killed, in the Russian democratic opposition against Vladimir Putin's regime. Not only its authoritarianism, but also its corruption and its nepotism, which is the heart of that rotten system. And as you know, Navalny has engaged in many high-profile and prominent anti-corruption investigations in recent years, directed at Vladimir Putin's close circle. And I think it's also very important to keep this in international spotlight. The reason I'm joined a little bit late, because I just talked to Mark McKinnon from the Globe and Mail, because he called up to get my comment on this, and I tried to speak to everybody who's getting in touch, because as I know, and I'm living testimony to that, international attention can save a life. I don't know if I'd be sitting here speaking with you now if there wasn't so much public spotlight on my own poisoning, because of course it's much easier to commit a crime in darkness than when the spotlight is on. It was heartening to see so many strong statements from the European Union, from Britain, from both sides of the aisle, and the American Congress. I hope this continues. Let's keep the spotlight on together, all of us. And once once this immediate crisis is over, I think it's important to start talking about responsibility for those people who continue to do this, to those who oppose Vladimir Putin's regime, Russians and non-Russians, politicians, journalists, those they consider traitors, foreigners they don't like. Urban Kotler, the former Justice Minister of Canada, was himself a victim of similar poisoning, thankfully not as severe, but still while he was on a visit to Russia in the early 2000s. And if we look back, I mean, this was a tool they used back in Soviet days too. Remember in the 70s, the KGB poisoned, for example, Vladimir Vainovich, a famous Russian dissident writer. They poisoned Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident in London. So they did use that a long time ago, but it was kind of an on and off method. Since Putin came to power, this really became a favorite tool. And there's a whole slate of names since the early 2000s of people who have been targeted by poisoning. Some were lucky enough to survive like myself, others were not. You know, Yuri Shekharchikhin, a prominent investigative journalist and an opposition member of parliament, was killed in 2003 through poisoning. Anna Politkovskaya was poisoned 2 years before she would be gunned down. I mentioned Viktor Yushchenko, Alexander Litvinenko, Sergei Skripal, of course, more recently, Urban Kotler, the former Justice Minister of Canada, Pyotr Verzilov, who is actually a Canadian citizen as well, dual Russian-Canadian citizen, Russian opposition activist, myself twice, and now today, Alexei Navalny. So again, I hope and pray that's the most important thing now, that he pulls out of this. Russia has some of the most amazing doctors in the world. Again, I'm living testimony to that. I would not be here otherwise. The most important thing is that Russian doctors are allowed by Russian authorities to actually do their job. And this is why international spotlight is so important now. On the topic of our discussion today, it's very difficult in our part of Europe, in our part of the world, to disassociate politics and historical memory because, and I think, and I hope Andrei will agree with this with regard to Lukashenko, it's certainly true with regard to Putin. They want to control historical memory, no less than they want to control elections or current political life. Both Lukashenko and Putin began with reinstating Soviet state symbols. Lukashenko in 1995 brought back the flag and the national crest of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Vladimir Putin in the year 2000 restored the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as a national anthem of the Russian Federation. And that was the clearest possible signal of the direction he would take our country. And symbols very soon turned into substance as Putin's regime cleansed parliament of any real opposition, turned elections into meaningless rituals, tamed the courts, shut down independent media outlets, began imprisoning and yes, killing opponents. Yesterday marked 2,000 days since Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, was gunned down directly in front of the Kremlin in Moscow. And to this day, the organizers of his murder continue to be fully shielded and protected from the highest levels of the Russian government. And this domestic situation has very clear repercussions on the international stage. In Russia, always domestic repression and external aggression were two sides of the same coin. They always went hand in hand. There's no reason, for a regime that tramples on its own citizens and disregards its own laws to respect international norms or the interests of other countries. Why would it? And so very quickly we saw this domestic repression under Putin turn into external aggression. Those Western leaders who for years shut their eyes or preferred to look the other way while Putin shut down independent TV networks in Russia, rigged elections in Russia, jailed opposition leaders in Russia. One day, these Western leaders woke up to the first state-to-state territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which is what Vladimir Putin did with Crimea in 2014. Those things are interconnected and interrelated. They are also, by the way, interconnected the other way, in a good way. Whenever I'm in Tallinn, which I hope to be again soon once all of this craziness is over, I always make a point to go to Nune Street, which is just off the old town, where there is a bas-relief that was installed in 2013, funded by Estonian civil society, to honor and commemorate Boris Yeltsin, the first and the only democratically elected president of the Russian Federation, to commemorate his role in helping restore the independence of the Baltic states. And I like standing by that bas-relief and watch the reaction from Western tourists, people from Western Europe or Americans, who and it's the inscriptions in three languages, Russian, Estonian, and English. And so they look at this, they stop and look, and I see most of all, I see disbelief on the faces. How is it possible that a Russian president could help a Soviet captive nation achieve independence? Well, you know what? That's what happens when we have a government in Russia that's democratic towards our own people. And that is based on respect, or at least aspires to respect, democratic norms, free elections, media freedom, the rule of law, and so on. And so when that day finally comes, which it will, when Russia has a democratically elected government that will respect the rules and norms of civilized society in our own country at home, this will also have very important positive consequences on international politics. And I think that will be to the benefit of the whole world community. And finally, I just want to say that too often, far too often, Western politicians and Western journalists and Western NGOs, and this goes for both those who are for Putin and who are against him, too often people in the West confuse Russia and the Putin regime. And I'm always grateful to Marcus for never doing that. And there are a few other people who don't, but most people do. I guess it's just shorthand. It's just easy to say Russian aggression, Russian behavior, you know, Russia this, Russia that. It's not Russia. You know, please don't equate a culturally rich, diverse, great nation with a kleptocratic, authoritarian, corrupt, criminal regime that misrules it. Those two things are different. And that's, by the way, exactly the same for Belarus. And I'm sure Andrei will agree with this. Those two things are different. And there are so many people in Russia today, and I know this from my own work and from traveling frequently all over the country, at least I was before this quarantine set in, but I hope to resume that again once it's finally over. Everywhere I go, and I was just a few months ago before this started, I was in Syktyvkar, the Republic of Komi. Marcus, I believe you were there as well, because it's they are a people related to the Estonian people, I think, right? It's the same group. Finno-Ugric peoples, right, in the Komi Republic. Even the language, you can see it. So I was in Syktyvkar in the end of February for my new film screening. I made a documentary recently on somebody who's actually a very prominent figure in the human rights movement in the Soviet Union and now in Russia, a Russian Orthodox priest. Father Georgy Edelstein is his name. So I was screening that film, and then we had a discussion afterwards. And a lot of everywhere, you know, in all these events in many places around Russia, it would often be young people who would come to take part in this. And I noticed, and I've been noticing it for a while, but it's really struck me now this time in Syktyvkar in February that, you know, back some years ago, it would always be possible, and I'm a Muscovite, so maybe there's a bit of a snobbery in here, but there's also some grain of truth. Back a few years ago, you were always able to tell the difference between a provincial audience and the audience, say, from Moscow and St. Petersburg. It would be a different quality of conversation. There are people who talk about different things, ask different questions. That difference is still there for older generations. It's not there anymore for people 30 years of age and younger. And I kind of thought to myself as I was speaking to them that, you know, these youngsters who were asking these questions, who were making these comments, who were speaking to me in Syktyvkar, they could be, you know, I could be in Moscow or in Petersburg or Novosibirsk, because this young generation, it's not that they don't trust Russian state television, they don't watch it. They take their news just as their counterparts in other European countries or here in North America. They take their news from, you know, they read the same Twitter feeds, they watch the same YouTube videos, they use the same social media. It's a whole different generation. They live in a whole different information reality. And that generation, even if you look at the polls recent towards polls that were taken before the recent plebiscite that Putin held to violate the constitutional term limit, also something, by the way, he borrowed from Lukashenko's example. If you look, first of all, overall even, the figures in Russia were split. So all that nonsense about 80 or whatever % for Putin, that has nothing to do with reality. Even overall figures were split, and that says a lot in an authoritarian society where many people would be afraid to honestly say that they're against the regime to a pollster, somebody you've never seen before. But even in that condition, it was half-half. So in fact, probably more opposed than support. But if you look at the polls within the young generation, those below 30, you will see massive opposition to Putin and his regime, even in the poll figures. So in reality, it's probably much higher. That is the best hope for Russia. Those are the people we work for. Those are the people who represent the best hope that one day, and I go back to Alexei Navalny because he was asked a few weeks ago, he was doing a radio show on Echo of Moscow, and he was asking, what are your ambitions? What do you want to happen? And, maybe the journalist was expecting some grandstanding or some great sounding phrases. Navalny answered very simply. He said, we just want Russia to become a normal European country. And I think I could never put it better than that. And I think that's our main ambition. I have no doubt that one day this goal will be realized. And those young people all over the country represent the best hope for that. And we watch with great attention what's happening in Belarus today. And of course, we stand in solidarity and wish all the strength and support to our friends in Belarus who are rising up against the regime of Aleksandr Lukashenka. Because I mentioned earlier that Putin has been copying a lot of what Lukashenko has been doing with about a 4 or 5 year delay, if you look at what's been happening. But because he came to power 5 years after Lukashenko, that makes sense. And so a lot of people in Russia today are saying that what's happening in Minsk today, we will be seeing on the streets of Russian cities in 2024, when the next Russian presidential election is due. And so what happens in Belarus in the next few days is obviously very important in itself, but it's also very important for us in Russia for inspiration and solidarity and precedent and example. So I'm honored to share this virtual stage with Andrei, and I hope to be able to see both Andrei and Marcus in real life before too long. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. One of the things I'm going to ask you both about once Andrei finishes up his introductory remarks is how we can help in the West. What can we do, both in Belarus and in Russia? And of course, I need to mention the fact that that Vladimir and I have been working together to honor Boris Nemtsov with a street renaming inside Earl Bales Park here in Toronto, which was supported by hundreds of local residents, members of parliament, members of provincial parliament, and of the vast majority of respondents to a recent City of Toronto public consultation. But sadly, the effort was rejected last year and put on hold due to what seems to be some influence by the Russian embassy here in Ottawa. But so we're going to continue that battle to honor Boris here in Toronto, and
it's important to say that 4 world capitals have already done this: Vilnius, Kiev, Prague, and first and foremost Washington D.C. That was the first capital to honor him with street designations. In all of those 4 capital cities, Russian embassies are now standing on streets and squares and parks named after Boris Nemtsov. And to me, as a Russian citizen, as a Russian politician, there can be nothing more pro-Russian than to have a street in front of the Russian embassy named after a Russian statesman. And I know the day will come when our country will be proud of that. And I hope it will happen in Canada too. And I know Marcus and I will continue these efforts and we'll get it done.
That's right. Now, over to Andrei. Looking forward to hearing your remarks about what's going on in Belarus right now and your view on that.
Thank you, Marcus. Good to see you. Vladimir, hi. Thank you for organizing this. And it takes an Estonian from the Central and Eastern European Council on Canada and Ukrainians from Ukrainian Canadian Congress to organize the Molotov-Ribbentrop discussion, which is quite important. But first of all, of course, I would like to send the best wishes for Alexei Navalny, and we are thinking about him. We know him very well, and we, of course, a lot of worries about his health, about his whole situation. There was a bet, I think, by a Russian journalist who will be the first from pro-Kremlin propagandists to say that, but Putin has nothing to gain from it, as was said when Anna Politkovskaya was killed. And predictably, this phrase is already flying from behind the Kremlin walls. I would like to remember the commemoration that we did before the lockdowns last year for the 80th anniversary of, not anniversary, wouldn't call it anniversary, in Toronto, which Marcus organized. And I think that we were, all of the panelists were quite sounding the alarm bell about what's going on in connection with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but we didn't expect that the historic turn that for example, the Russian leader has taken with this pact and blaming other countries of signing the similar pacts before Soviet Union. So in other words, putting these secret agreements to divide Europe into the same category as the legitimate agreements of countries trying to prevent the war. And I think that in general, it is something very disturbing that is going on, because it's not only that the Stalin's time and Stalin himself being rehabilitated and glorified. it is that modern Russian leadership is looking into the Stalin's period as the source of inspiration for today, and it's trying to shape the whole system in Russia according to the Stalin's guidelines, and that is really alarming, because it is both going on in Russia and in Belarus. And Lukashenko, they are grandsons of Stalin's, and I think that it is quite indicative of what we can expect from both rulers, and where it could lead us. And speaking of today, of freedom fight, it was, I think what is going on in Belarus is something that we predicted that would happen. And we also predicted that the soft position on gross human rights violations, soft position of the West, first of all, on which for a long time tried to ignore the atrocities that were going on in Belarus, and led indirectly, or in some cases directly, led to the situation today. I agree with Vladimir that semantics are very important. Vladimir said that don't compare Russia and Putin. I would even tell more: start calling spade a spade. There is no authoritarian regime in Belarus. There's a clear dictatorship, and now we see all the nasty manifestation of this dictatorship, because people are being killed, and Lukashenko is a murderer today. He is not a soft or light authoritarian ruler. He is a dictator who is killing people. And I think we also spoke about it in Toronto last year, that the complacency of the West with the criminals who are recognized as legitimate rulers of their countries will lead to international breaches in security, which is happening right now, and which Vladimir referred to, this annexation of Crimea, and before that we have to remember Georgia also. So this kind of remapping the world in favor of the illegitimate, unlawful rulers of the countries is happening right now before the eyes of the people and especially of the people in the West, because unfortunately we don't have any leverage on the regime inside Belarus. I mean leverage, usual leverage, like independent judiciary. We don't have independent judiciary. We cannot, even those people who were tortured or killed, their relatives cannot go to the court in Belarus, or neither in Russia, and to seek for justice. The only justice that could come is from democratic world, and that's why and today democratic world has more tools than before. I'm speaking about Magnitsky Act. Magnitsky Act, which Boris Nemtsov was lobbying and was working and promoting very much, and I think it's one of his greatest achievements to explain to first of all to the American lawmakers that Magnitsky Act is actually for Russia, and it is directed to support Russia and Russian people and Russian democracy. So we have more tools today. I mean, the West has more tools, and it has to be applied. Otherwise, we'll be facing more and more dangerous situation. Marcus asks what could be done to help. Don't overlook all these atrocities that are going on now in Belarus. Don't be shy to introduce very strict, very strong sanctions against these people. I know that Canada is capable of this. If speaking of Canada, I know that Europe is capable of it. But what we see and hear from Europe, for example, and which is alarming, that European Council President Charles Michel is not ashamed to say that he discussed the situation in Belarus with Putin. What's going on? We're talking about the independence of Belarus, and even Lukashenko was for some time seen as guarantor of independence. And then European leadership is discussing the fate of the people who are dying now in the streets to gain freedom, to go back to normal life, to defend their independence with the person who all these years supported the regime of Lukashenko, and without whose support this regime wouldn't survive at all. So I think that these things have to be noticed by all of us, and especially by democratic world, because today our life is at stake. Life of ordinary people in Belarus and life of Belarus as a state is at stake. So I think that I'm grateful really to Marcus, to Vladimir, because they're real friends, and they always are very supportive to our cause. But we need broader solidarity. We need more attention, and we need measures that are adequate and not just concerns. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrei. And just going on to Magnitsky sanctions, all three of us have really worked on this campaign to a certain degree, whether it's here in Canada, elsewhere. And my sense in Canada is that although we've adopted this legislation, we've done the bare minimum of adding the names that were connected to the Magnitsky case, a few others. There's a real reluctance to use this tool. I think there's a fear specifically within the Russian context to use it. And, you know, I think the Canadian government over the past 12 months has overall demonstrated a bit of a reluctance to go too hard on any of these regimes, including Moscow. And, you know, at the very least, they've rejected the results in the recent election. Is there more that we need to be doing? I mean, should we be coordinating these sanctions? You know, I think enforcement is another problem. Enforcing these sanctions properly. We have an agricultural bank, a Russian agricultural bank here in Canada that's on our sanctions list, but somehow it's managed to become a paying member of a Russia-Canada business association without any sort of repercussions. What does the sanctions mean, and should we be doing more to hold these regimes accountable?
Well, first of all, I would say that non-recognition in itself is very important. And Marcus, as somebody from a Baltic state, you know how important that is and how that was historically, the Stimson doctrine and everything, and the Wells Declaration, everything that went with that. I was very heartened to see those strong messages of non-recognition of Lukashenko's quote-unquote victory. Of course, at the emergency EU heads of state and government summit yesterday, earlier on from the Canadian foreign minister, from the British foreign secretary, of course from the Baltic states, but that's to be expected. I mean, there are no stronger voices for a rule of law and democracy in the European Union than the Baltic states, but even those kind of quote-unquote old Western countries have spoken out quite strongly on this. This is encouraging and this is important. As Andrei said a few minutes ago, let's call a spade a spade. Let's call things for what they are. Lukashenko is not the president of Belarus. He is an illegitimate dictator, and he should finally, it's astonishing that we're talking about this after 26 years that he's been in power, but he should finally be recognized as such. Exactly the same goes for Vladimir Putin. I mentioned a few minutes ago this sham plebiscite that Putin held on the 1st of July to waive or violate or bypass the constitutional term limits. That was actually a very important turning point in the development of Putin's regime. In my mind, and in the mind of a lot of my colleagues in the Russian opposition, Putin has been illegitimate de facto for a very long time. We know how he prolonged his power. We know the rigged elections and the disqualification of opponents from the ballot and the job swap with Medvedev, who was quote unquote president of Russia. I don't know if anybody still remembers that name. So all of these tricks he used to try to prolong his power up till now, but he was very careful to maintain the appearances. And that's important. He was very careful to pretend to stick to the letter of the law, even as he broke the spirit of the law. What happened on the 1st of July makes a world of difference. For the first time, he broke the letter of the law as well. That constitutional amendment that bypasses Putin's term limits is not just illegitimate, it's actually plainly illegal. Because the way it was done, and I'm not going to go on for this, there have already been actually publications on this, so you can go and read if you're interested, and I'll be happy to send links too. But it's illegal for two main reasons. The first reason is that the constitutional amendments themselves, there is a procedure in Russian law on how to make a constitutional amendment. And it was violated in numerous ways. That's the first thing. And the second, and perhaps more important thing, the plebiscite itself was organized in such a way that even all previous elections in Russia under Putin seemed like you know, an example of democracy, which of course I don't need to tell you they were not. Because in this plebiscite, every last rule was broken. It didn't correspond in any way possible, for example, to the OSCE Copenhagen document, which is kind of the main international framework, at least for those of us who are OSCE members, which goes for Russia, Belarus, and Canada. We're all in the OSCE. The OSCE Copenhagen documents provides for very clear standards and rules about the election. For example, that there needs to be campaigning allowed on both sides, that there needs to be international or independent observation. None of that happened in Putin's plebiscite. There was a week-long early voting, if you can believe that, and every night those ballots were stored, you know, in safes in electoral commission offices with no outside control or oversight. No independent observers were allowed. Political parties were not allowed to send observers. International organizations, including the OSCE, were not allowed to send observers. So the results of this plebiscite had nothing to do with what actually happened at the ballot box. There were 2 exit polls conducted, showed in Moscow and St. Petersburg a clear majority voted against Putin's amendments. Of course, the official result was overwhelmingly in favor. Andrei will find everything I'm talking about very familiar because they've had it in Belarus for a long time. This is what we had in this plebiscite. And this is important. The reason I spent so much time on this plebiscite is a game changer. So Putin has been illegitimate de facto for a while. Now he becomes illegitimate de jure as well. And so when his current presidential term runs out in, 3.5 years' time, in May of 2024, this is it. And the international community must make clear that this is it. And that there will be non-recognition if he decides to stick and stay in the Kremlin beyond May 2024, just as there was non-recognition of Lukashenko now. And on sanctions, Marcus, you asked about the Magnitsky Act. First of all, and Andrei, thank you for referring to that phrase from Boris Nemtsov when he said that Magnitsky law is pro-Russian. He actually said, and I often quote this when I speak at parliamentary hearings and such, Boris said that this is the most pro-Russian law. The Magnitsky Act is the most pro-Russian law ever passed abroad, because it's a law that targets those people who abuse the rights of our citizens and who steal the money of our taxpayers. What can be more pro-Russian than that to keep those people responsible? The problem is the implementation. Well, first of all, there are only 6 countries still who have this law, right? So Canada, of course, the United States, the United Kingdom, which finally just started implementing it, and the 3 Baltic states. And this is it. So first of all, it needs to be expanded geographically. There needs to be a Magnitsky Act in the European Union. That's the most important place to have it, no question, for obvious reasons. But also, even the countries that have it, like the US and Canada and the UK, frankly, they should do a better job of implementing it and raising the level of people. There shouldn't be a glass ceiling that if you're above a certain official position, or that if you're close to Putin, you're not going to be sanctioned. That defeats the whole purpose of the law. The whole purpose is to go after those high-ranking abusers who enjoy complete impunity and protection at home. And this largely hasn't been happening yet. There have been some very important moves in the US in the last 3 years when there were some very high-ranking human rights abusers from Putin's regime who have been added on the Magnitsky list. I will name 3. Alexander Bastrykin, head of the investigative committee, who has been involved in many politically motivated prosecutions of political prisoners and so on, who's also been involved in sabotaging the investigation to the murder of Boris Nemtsov. He's been added to the US Magnitsky list. He's the most high-profile person on it and the most high-ranking Russian government official in it to date. Secondly, Ramzan Kadyrov. Of course, that name's very familiar to all of our listeners, perhaps the most egregious human rights abuser among Russian officials today. He has been added to the list. And last year, in May of 2019, so just over a year ago, Major Ruslan Geremeyev, who is an officer in the Russian Interior Ministry, a close confidant of Kadyrov, who served as one of the low-level organizers of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, was added by the US government publicly on its Magnitsky list. And when they did this, the US Treasury actually specified that this guy, Geremeyev, was acting as an agent of or on behalf of Ramzan Kadyrov. So in effect, they double designated Kadyrov. And the question I posed, and many of my colleagues did publicly after that designation, first of all, we all know how difficult it is to actually get somebody on the Magnitsky list, how much evidence you have to go through, how thorough the vetting process must be. So after the US government did this and actually specified that this guy, Geremeyev, was acting on Kadyrov's behalf, the question many of us posed was that if a serving officer in the Russian Interior Ministry and a key confidant of a Kremlin-backed regional leader was a low-level organizer in the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who then was the ultimate mastermind?
Mm-hmm. Well, good question. Andrei, how effective, and sorry, Vladimir, you're going to have to leave us.
I'll need to run because of the situation. I just want to make sure to get the maximum attention to what's happening to Alexei, because I know from my own experience that this attention can save lives. So I thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm sorry I can't stay longer, but it's a crazy day. So
Absolutely.
I hope we'll meet again, and not just like this, but in real life too. And it's always great to share the stage with Andrei.
Thank you so much, Vladimir, for joining us. I know how busy your day is. Thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you so much.
We'll see you soon.
It's wonderful to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Andrei, back to sanctions quickly. How effective will sanctions be on the Lukashenko regime if they're not coordinated properly with the EU, with the US, Canada, UK, obviously? Do you think those sanctions will have a real effect in changing the behavior of the regime?
Yes, I'm sure about that. And first of all, we need them immediately, because the crimes are going on a regular basis, on a daily basis, starting from end of May, because when the candidates started to be arrested, thrown in prison, and then they were tortured there, and now that is the behavior of the regime is simply beyond all the international standards, breaking all the international standards, and including international obligations of Belarus as a state. Sanctions are effective, and yes, there is a question of enforcement, but there is also a question of political will. Let me give you one example about Canada. In 2006, when there were sanctions introduced after the yet another fraudulent election and protests and the violence used by Lukashenko regime against peaceful demonstrations, Canada refused the landing of the Prime Minister of Belarus plane on its territory for refueling that was going on to Cuba. And it was, some people who were concerned with the situation in Belarus. I think that the foreign minister at that time was Peter MacKay, and the prime minister and the foreign minister, they took a decision and denied the landing for the plane. And Canada was not in the forefront of introducing sanctions, but the political will and the real solidarity with the people in Belarus made it possible. And it was a very strong slap on the face for the regime. And they did understand that it is, you cannot be joking with the democratic world. So the sanctions are effective when they implemented. The sanctions are effective when they are not lifted, because one of the serial criminals in Belarus is Lydia Yermoshina, who heads Lukashenko's Central Election Committee for all these years, and who actually substituted Viktor Gonchar, not substituted, she was appointed against all laws, even those laws existed at that time in Belarus, to take his place. And Viktor Gonchar was later killed by the regime, as you know. So she was under sanctions, and she was complaining that she wanted so badly to go to Paris and to see Paris, and she couldn't go there. Then in 2015, the European Union suspended sanctions, and in 2016, it lifted sanctions. And Yermoshina, the criminal, immediately went to Paris and went on the tour to Italy, and was so happy and was, telling every media in Belarus about how happy she was. That was the signal to Belarusians, to the ordinary people, that there is impunity for real criminals. And you cannot fight. People are fighting today knowing that they are fighting for the just cause. They are fighting for their freedom. They are fighting for their dignity. But when there is no appreciation of this fight outside, and even not about appreciation, because ordinary people outside do appreciate what we are doing. But if there is no punishment of the criminals from the only community that is able to punish it, democratic community, mostly Western community, then it's not only problem for us, for Belarusians, but also for the world, as I said before. because it is a serious threat to the security. It is a serious threat. The regime of Lukashenko is a serious threat to our neighbors, to Ukraine, to Poland, to Baltic states. It is a real threat, and it is not a humanitarian threat. It's a military threat, as the major exercises on the territory of Belarus have demonstrated all these years. Those exercises were possible only because Lukashenko was in power. And he paid with our independence and with our territory to Kremlin generals who wanted to show strength and to demonstrate their aggressiveness towards the West. And if we remember, one of the goals of the first major exercise, Zapad 2013, I believe, was the nuclear strikes on Warsaw. And that was the plan that was leaked afterwards, after the exercise. So simply, politicians should understand that there is no separate, there is, in other words, human rights are directly connected with the hard security. In other words, the soft security is connected with hard security. If you ignore these regimes and behavior of such regimes, you are threatening your own security, even in Canada, because, you know, Canada is now deployed. The Canadian troops are deployed in Baltic states, and they're in danger as well. So I think that the world is becoming more and more interconnected, but it cannot handle the atrocities of regimes like Lukashenko. And one last thing, I was saying it for a long time. If you cannot find soft power to deal with petty dictators, you will have no chance against bigger dictators.
Good point. And these are the things that I've been trying to impress on our government here as well, is that I think Canada, as a defender of human rights, has a real responsibility to help the people of Belarus in any way they can. Sanctions are one of them. We have this tool. The atrocities that we've been seeing over the past 2 weeks, especially that first week after the elections, they were horrific. They were barbaric. What was happening, the accounts of what was happening in the prisons in Minsk, rape, the way that batons were being used to choke some of the protesters. We can't stand by. We have a responsibility to protect the human rights situation on the ground and the protesters. But you bring up a good point, national security. It's in Canada's interest, it's in the West's interest to make sure that we secure do as much as we can to secure the situation. You know, if it's true that that Putin's troops are moving into Belarus, if there's such a situation that that Putin tries to take over a part or all of Belarus, there's a serious security implication with the Suwalki Gap. And for our viewers who don't know, there's about a 60-kilometer gap between the border of Belarus and Kaliningrad. It's the only land connection for NATO to the Baltic states. And this has been identified as experts over the past several years, past decade, as a very, very important and an area that's at serious threat of Russian action. So we need to place, it's in our interest, in our own national interest, to place sanctions on these rulers against the Lukashenko regime and his officials. Now, I'm going to go to a quick question online. This is from Peter and Natalia in Ottawa. And Andrei, the question is, what is your thought about the absence of real and strong leadership and plans in the current situation in Belarus? I think they were referring perhaps to the opposition and the decentralized nature of that opposition. Some leaders are in prison, some are abroad. How do you see things moving forward in this case with this decentralized opposition that we're seeing right now in Belarus?
Yes, it is true, but the things are moving on. Protests are continuing. The strikes has started. It's you know, when Nelson Mandela was in prison over the question that the protest movement was without leadership. When Václav Havel or Lech Walesa were in prison for different terms, nobody questioned that there was nobody put this question that there was no leadership. Yes, we do have leaders in prison today, especially those leaders who are known to be leaders of protests and strong leaders against this regime, like Nikolai Statkevich and Pavel Severinets, and then recently Sergei Tikhanovsky and Viktor Babarika. And one of the strong demands from the people protests is to release these political prisoners. So I think that even in jail, they're uniting people. Even in jail, people they are leaders and they're symbols, because people do understand that without their release, it will be probably it will be more difficult to achieve the results. So I don't see a serious problem here, because we do have leaders. And besides, we are having more and more leaders who were previously unknown, who are capable of self-organizing. I mean, the groups that are capable of self-organizing and helping people. And I'm really happy to see new faces today leading the protests.
So looking at the time, one final question from me then. Where do you see things going? We saw that Lukashenko, was it yesterday, the day before, said he's ordering a new crackdown on the protesters. How long will the people of Belarus be able to protest under these sorts of conditions? How far will Lukashenko go, and is there an end to this? Will he effectively suppress the protest movement, the pro-democracy movement, as we're seeing it right now? Where do you think this is going?
I think he's finished. Even if he managed to stop the protests and stifle the protests, I think he's finished, because it's simply impossible. He did some unbelievable. He achieved something unbelievable. He managed to offend every Belarusian during the pandemic, everyone, and I believe even his own people, because his behavior during the pandemic was the red line for the people in Belarus. That's why you saw such a mass. You are seeing such a mass protest today, and he continued to cross these red lines, and he's crossing them. I think that. I forgot to mention one very important fact. When people compare the situation in Belarus with the revolution in Ukraine, they compare, the comparison is justifiable and not, because very interesting, there is no Russian factor in Belarus protest at all. There is nobody. The only player who wants to introduce Russian factor is Lukashenko. He is trying to involve Putin. He is trying to say that the protesters are anti-Russian. No. There was even sympathy expressed towards Russian and Russian people, and absolutely no animosity among the people. They hate Lukashenko. They are getting more and more angry with him. They want to get rid of him. So all the speculations about Putin next moves, very grounded. Yes, I do agree, because you never know what Kremlin would do the next day. But it will be so obvious that it will be unwarranted, it will be unjustified, it will be without any even artificial arguments or any artificial pretext. And for how long Lukashenko will stay there in Belarus and continue with his brutality also depends on all of us, on Belarusians and also on the international community, because soft measures, as we agreed, soft measures taken against dictators or statements, expression of concerns will not help us. And the first, violence have to be stopped, and sanctions will definitely help to stop the violence in the streets. And the violence is coming only from Lukashenko. You see it. Sometimes, it's very painful to see how peaceful Belarusians are. even when they're killed, even when they're being beaten, even when they're being tortured. So it has to be stopped. And I think that inside the country, there are efforts to stop this violence, but there have to be matching efforts or stronger efforts from outside. So I do hope that Belarus is on the right path of becoming democratic and independent. But the moment is quite precarious, and solidarity is needed. That's our usual message, but you, Marcus, understand it better than anyone.
Well, and I think one of the things that has struck every Canadian who's, if you've watched any of the images coming through social media, Nexta, Belsat, is the peaceful nature of these protests and the disproportionately violent reaction of that regime. It's shocking. I mean, it's truly emotional watching some of those images. And my real hope is that there is some way that Canada will work with its EU partners, with the US, with the UK to coordinate those sanctions. And not just coordinate those sanctions, but look for other ways that we can help Belarusian civil society, how we can help diaspora groups. I mean, one of the things that I think that our Ukrainian brothers and sisters, one of the biggest things that they had going on during Maidan was a strong diaspora community that kept those issues on the national media radar, in the eye of the politicians. And whatever we can do as Central and Eastern Europeans to help the Belarusian diaspora and civil society, we'll try and continue to do that. And any other measures as well. One of the things that I was struck by was the fact that the internet was completely shut down in Belarus for days on end. This is something that we can help with in the West. There are measures that we can take. There are new technologies out, whether it's Elon Musk's new system, broadband, low orbit internet satellites, long-range Wi-Fi transponders. These are things that I think we need to do right now to help Belarus, and we can use these same measures to help in other situations at other times. But there's a lot of work to be done, and Andrei, I don't know if you have any last thoughts that you'd like to give before we close off this session.
No, it's simply, again, I would like to repeat the message that Belarus is worth fighting for, worth helping, and everything you said about helping the civil society, especially very important, helping with technologies, with new technologies, and trying to involve major IT companies in the situation in Belarus, so that they would not help the dictators but help the people, and with their capabilities, like Facebook, like Google, like Twitter, that would always helpful. And I think that Belarus is also very, let's say, promising case for the future of democracy in the world, because as we know, the Freedom House classification is really depressing, because more and more countries are listed as non-democratic, and we have to reverse this tendency, and Belarus might be the case that will serve this purpose.
Well, we can only keep our fingers crossed, and we'll do all we can here. That I can promise to help that along. Thank you, sir, for your friendship and for your brave efforts all of these years. I sincerely hope that you can return to your home in the coming weeks and continue the fight there. And like I said, if there's anything that we can do to help you, you know where to reach us. We'll do all that we can from here. We're going to help fight for that, the freedom for Belarus, as long as it takes. So keep up the good fight, my friend. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for this event.
And thank you for everyone for tuning in today for this Black Ribbon Day 81st anniversary seminar. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next year.